It's really a pleasure to see people coming out. We've been traveling around the state now to several different places, and it's really invigorating to me to see people in all the communities coming out for these sessions. It gives me great hope that something's going to happen. And to demonstrate that a little bit, I want to ask you a few questions. How many of you know 1, 2, or 3 people who do not have health insurance? Right, almost everybody here. How many of you know someone who has lost life savings or faced bankruptcy because of medical bills, right? Almost quite a few, half of you. How many know someone who has neglected treatment or medication? How many of you included yourselves in these questions that I just asked? You know, this is the only country, civilized country in the world that I know of where people would raise their hands to any of those questions. It proves that we're Americans because that only happens in America, all of these questions. But the really important part of that, the really important part I think that slips by us, is that we could go to any community in this state, any community across the country, and get almost any random gathering of people and ask those questions and get the same answer, get the same proportion of people raising their hands. And that's the real problem that we're talking about here. And I'm here to say that those people need to know they're not alone. When we all realize we're not alone, when we can stand together for this outrage that we call the national health system, then change will happen. One of the things I like to point out, and Kevin, to my great pleasure, mentioned it today, and I haven't mentioned it before in these talks, but every significant movement that I know of in this country did not take place until the problem was identified as a violation of a right, and when the people took to the streets to demonstrate that. Think about it in terms of slavery, in terms of women's suffrage, in terms of child labor laws. All of those things, those major movements that makes this country what it is, all of those movements did not become movements until they were identified as a human right, and when enough people got together and recognized that they had that common purpose, then something got done. And that's why it's so invigorating to me to see all these people from communities coming out. Once we can all stand together, and I was also really pleased to hear Kevin talk about that. It's not about the legislature, it's not about the Congress, it's not even about the corporations. It is at one level, of course. But what it's about in terms of change is when we all realize that we can stand together and then we can get something done. That to me is the significant thing. So one of the things that we can do is to perfect how we make our messages. And I want to talk about messaging today and how we can put together the message. To me, there are, for any presentation, there are at least 4 fundamental components of that. One is the knowledge of self. We don't talk about that much in terms of presentation, but it begins, effective presentation, I think, begins with the knowledge and understanding of oneself and why you're doing what you're doing. Secondly is understanding the audience. That certainly makes sense. Third is understanding the issues and the topics of the presentation you're going to make. That's free. And the last that we'll get to is then putting together, having those things in mind, having been comfortable with those 3 aspects, then we're ready to put together a presentation that will be effective. And I'll try to, I have some words about each one of those. First of all, preparing oneself to speak, or gaining that knowledge of self. I think one of the most significant things to overcome in making a public presentation, or even talking to someone who knows that you disagree with them, or that they disagree, or to experiencing yourself in a minority of any sense, is to overcome the anxiety that goes along with that feeling. It seems to me that's one of the first things to do. I had the privilege when I attended a convention. This was a convention of speech professors. There were about 400 of us in the audience. One person was standing behind a table, and he started his presentation. We could see his trousers shaking because his knees were shaking. He raised his hand and was trembling a bit. There was a tremor in his voice. Now you tell me what the audience was thinking at that point.
Poor guy.
Poor guy, anxious for him, pulling for him, and so on. I was, anyway, I was in the audience, I was watching this, and I said, he's going to lose it. And at that point, he stopped, paused for a moment, looked at the audience and said, I guess it's apparent to you that I'm terrified. In spite of that, if you bear with me, he said, I'll try to get us some information that is useful. Now tell me what the audience did at that point. They sighed, they forgave him, they relaxed, they sighed, and he went on. And with he was still anxious, of course, anyone would be, but he was able to get through it, and it was a successful presentation. The whole point of that story is anxiety does not go away. Over the years, people have come to me and said, how do I get rid of this anxiety? How do I not be anxious? And if anyone can answer that question, yeah, you'll make a lot of money on it, I think, because I certainly don't know the answer to it. Anxiety is with us. It's going to stay. How do I get rid of the anxiety is the wrong question. The question is, how do I become effective, or how do I deal with that anxiety? How do I say what I need to say or be who I want to be in spite of that anxiety? What level of anxiety can I tolerate? What is my comfort zone, and how far can I move out of my comfort zone and still be effective? That's the important question, it seems to me. I don't know anyone who is an effective speaker that does not experience anxiety before a presentation. I was standing, when I graduated from college, I was on the podium with a bunch of other students and the head of the department. The head of the department was old, full of years and honors, had all of our respect. We all thought he was just somewhere just beneath the deity, but not very far. And I happened to be sitting just 2 chairs away from him. And when he rose to speak, I was watching him, and I noticed his hand had a tremor. And I thought, my God has clay feet. Here was a person I thought who always had it together and so on. He was experiencing anxiety too. So the question is, the point is to confront the anxiety, know that it's there, but don't try to get rid of it, because it won't go away. The question is, what can you do in spite of it? There's some other things. Preparation, of course, makes a difference. Clear preparation and knowing what you're going to do I'll give you a few points about that. First of all, don't try to cover more than 2 or 3 points, maybe 4. First of all, and I'll talk more about this later, the audience is only going to remember about 10% of what you say. That's it. I can't quote the research on that, but your own experience will tell you that. Even when you hear really good speeches, if you say, what did he say? I don't know, but it was really good. So you might remember the main point, you might remember the central idea, and I'll talk about that. But the point is, they're going to remember about 10%, if you're good. The question is then, is what 10% do you want them to remember? What do you want them to focus on? So when you limit it now to 3 points, that'll be in support of a central idea, again I'll talk about that later, then that becomes your priority, so to speak, your list of what you go through to say, does this help to support or reinforce what I want to get at? Right. And if you do that, and know what those things are, 2 or 3 points, it's a lot easier to remember 2 or 3 points. One of my favorite stories about this, when I was a freshman in college, I was at Portland State University 1,000 years ago, and Martin Luther King came to speak, and of course he packed the house. I was in a balcony looking down on him, and he spoke for about 45 minutes. And the topic of the speech is, we've come a long way in civil rights, but we've got a long way to go. We've come a long way, he said, in social legislation, in education, and in social justice. Let me talk about each of those 3 things. Then he went through each one. And at the end of each one, he'd say, we've come a long way in social justice, but we have a long way to go. And he went through each of those points. He only had 3 points, 45 minutes with no jokes. And we wouldn't let him go. I remember we stood and applauded when he went. Now, that wasn't an essay. If you sat down and write an essay, you wouldn't do that. The next day in class, our professor asked, how many times do you think that he said, we've come a long way, we've got a long way to go? And I said, oh, everybody in class must have said it 4 or 5 times. He said it 17 times in the course of that speech, right? And we all remembered when we left, right? So it's not an essay, standing on a seat. You know, you've got just a few seconds, a few minutes to make that point. And it's important to know what it is, and that gives you confidence. If you know what that point is, then you know you can always come back to that and deal with it. The more difficult one for a lot of folks sometimes is willing to be in a minority. If I'm in a group of people and somebody speaks up and then says something that I disagree with that's fundamentally wrong for me and so on, I have a choice. I can go along with it and thereby be complicit in it or whatever. And whenever you do, whenever you raise that disagreement, especially when you're in a group, somebody says something to disagree, it's going to raise anxiety. There's no way to do it without doing that. Not only in yourself, but in the person that you're talking to. So it's willing then to be in that minority. That makes a difference. Is that making sense? How many of you found yourself in a situation where people are talking and all agreeing on something that you don't think is correct? It's anxiety producing, isn't it? There's something that has to happen for you to come up and deal with that. And the question is, we'll talk about that in a minute too, is how do you do that and maintain your own sanity and so on. So, knowledge of self is important. And what you're willing to do with, what you're willing to take responsibility for, what you're willing to let go, and so on. And there's a lot of situations, of course, where we choose not to enter. But it takes an act of courage to enter those situations, and knowing what it's worth for you, what kind of person you want to be, and what you can stand for, and move into it. It's also important to understand your audience and knowing what's going on. I'm going to talk about something that's a little complicated now. There's a really good book out, several good books, by a fellow by the name of Lakoff. Some of you heard of him, L-A-K-O-F-F. Don't Think of an Elephant. Yeah. It's one of his so forth. And he characterizes the difference between ultra-right or right-wing conservative thinking and the more left or the more liberal. I'd like to call it the strict versus the nurturant, the strict or the idea of discipline versus empathy. How many of you remember a movie, maybe I'm dating myself here, it was The Great Santini was the name. Robert Duvall played the part. He was a Marine lieutenant or something like that. And he ran his entire family like he ran a Marine platoon. With strict discipline. Discipline will make a man out of you, he told his kids, and this is how to behave, this is what works, and so on. And of course his family in the end rebelled against him. Versus what I would call the Carl Rogers model, the nurturant. We all have needs, let's understand one another and find joint solutions and so on. My hunch is that most of us here are more of the nurturant variety than the super disciplined variety. I don't know if that's the case, but my hunch is that's the case or he wouldn't be here. The demonizing terms for that, of course, would be dictator or whatever, and bleeding heart, or whatever those terms might be. I like to use the term instead, discipline versus empathy. There are times, of course, when we all instill discipline, use discipline, and respect it. That's certainly the case. There's also times, hopefully, when we're empathic with other people's needs and know what's happening. And it seems to me the well-adjusted individual is the one who strikes the balance. Lakoff has done, in some ways, I've come to this in the last few weeks, trying to integrate that into my own thinking. In a way, he's done a disservice. That is, talking about, it almost seems to say, here's how you talk to a conservative to change his mind. And what that means to me is, I don't think you're going to change a person's basic way they think. There are none so blind as those who will not see, somebody said once. And if that's their way of thinking, then that's the way of thinking, this kind of person they are. However, we do share values. We do share ideas. Nobody believes in freedom, I don't think, more than I do. No one believes in choice and autonomy of individual will, I think, more than I do. I tend to be that way. But if I try to argue that, if I believe that way, if that's all I believe, and somebody tries to argue that with me about cost and efficiency and empathy, all the literature says now that you lose. Those arguments don't make it. What we have to do is find ways to universalize those values, whether you're conservative, left, right, Democrat, Unitarian, or Catholic, or whatever. What are those human values and those human points of empathy that we can relate to? I said to a friend of mine once, this is quite a few years ago, when we were debating whether or not we could send aid to Bangladesh, when Bangladesh was in their dire straits and so on. He was against it. We had to take care of our people. We can't take care of them. So. And I asked him, I said, what if he woke up in the morning, John, and there was a black baby on your doorstep who was starving? What would you do? Just throw it out? Or would you try to help it and so on? He came out of his chair, angry. What kind of a person do you think I am, he said. I didn't say, well, we're trying to figure that out. But he was angry with me. And later on we talked, and then talked about need and so on, and were able to have a conversation. So the idea is, there are those points where we can speak and so on. But I don't think we need to try to change a conservative's mind. We won't turn a conservative into a liberal. We can find those points of connection, I think, that we can understand. One of the people that I've revered over my lifetime, and at least as a teacher, is Gandhi. And one of the things that Gandhi said, which has stuck with me at my most angry, when I'm so upset with somebody else, he said with great wisdom, I think, always regard your opponent as an ally. Always regard your opponent as an ally. That's one of the more powerful statements in terms of persuasion, in terms of motivation, I think that we can come up with. A friend of mine, a professor who made nameless now, was called upon to speak to an organization of state police. And this fellow, friend of mine, this was in the 70s, and at that point he had long hair and a beard and so on, longer than mine, and dressed in jeans, and so it looked like Charles Manson. He looked like Charles Manson, and so on. He's going to go speak to the state police about responsibility and civic duty and so on. And I thought, how is that going to happen? He started off talking to them about police as a minority group. He said, it must be terrible when you go on your job trying to do what you need to do and people are calling you pigs. And so on. He talked about several incidents that he knew about how police had been wrongly accused, how they had been maligned in certain areas and weren't able to defend themselves and so on. And in 10 minutes or so, he had converted from a hostile audience to an audience that was willing to listen. Again, always treating your opponents as an ally, as a powerful kind of thing. And if we don't do that, what are you doing? If I treat an opponent as an enemy, then the only thing I'm going to do is to reinforce that division between us. Now, sometimes there are people I don't want to talk to. Certainly there are folks that I would have a very difficult time having a sane conversation with. But if you choose to speak, if you choose to have that conversation, then what's the aim of that conversation? It can be to justify your own cynicism, and that's easy, or it can be to seek a potential ally. And for me, ethically, that's the only reason to have that discussion. Is that making sense? So when I feel that anger coming up in me, when I feel that people, who was it, yesterday I wouldn't even say this in public, except it came out on television yesterday, some guy talking about, a congressman talking about insurance and birth control, say the best birth control that we ever had was in the 70s when people prescribed aspirin for birth control. She said, what? She says, yeah, that was, they'll hold it between your knees, that's birth control. Said that before a national audience. And now, how do you react to that? I don't want to talk to him.
Right.
If I choose to talk to him, then I'm going to have to back off a little bit and try to get in touch with something that he can connect with. Otherwise, I'll increase the division. Early on, I don't think it'll offend anyone else. My wife and I were at the beach. We met my brother-in-law who had a friend with him, and I was introduced to his friend as a teacher at Portland State. And he said, you're teaching at Portland State. Isn't it difficult to put up with all those, he didn't say black people, in your class? How do you tell the difference between all the black people in your classes? He didn't say black people. And I remember, came up, and I remember backing off, stopped, and I said, well, in our classes, we tend to call them African Americans and black people, and I have no trouble at all telling the difference. What did he do? He apologized, backed off. You know, and I probably wouldn't have done that if my brother-in-law and sister hadn't been there. But by backing off and affirming who I was without condemning him, I created a space for conversation. I'm really proud of that one because other times I failed pretty miserably in those kind of situations. But when you can affirm the other is the only time that a connection can be made. All right. I'll just make the statement that a wise man told me a long time ago, and it actually sums up what we're talking about here. And that a wise man, a fool tries to convince me with his reasons. A wise man persuades me with my own.
That's what we need to do.
Pardon me?
That's what we need to do, the second one. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, that's what we need to do.
That's what we need to do. A fool tries to convince me with his reasons, a wise man persuades me with my own. I can give, somebody's in total disagreement with me, I give all the reasons I want as to why I believe that that's the case. And if he's not of a mind with me, doesn't mean anything. All right? We have to find out how that person is thinking.
That's a 3-minute warning.
Oh, 3 minutes? I'll be quick. Okay. Always attribute, then, the highest motives to your audience. Very quickly, Ralph Nader came to, was talking in Pasco, Washington, to all the people at Bechtel about nuclear energy. This was back in the 70s. There were anti-Nader banners across the main street in town. He was trying to speak, people were hooting and yelling at him, and so on. And finally, I was listening to this on the radio, he started to laugh. And I thought, he's losing it, I don't understand what's happening. But when he laughed, people calmed down a little bit. And then he said, you know, you people paid me a lot of money to come here and speak. And I'm happy for that, but it's your nickel. You know, you can hear what I have to say, and I think I have some information that might be valuable to you and your children, and you can evaluate it if you, as you will, but you can't do that unless you hear it. And if you bear with me, I'll try to give you some understanding that I've come out of my research and so forth that I think you'll find interesting. Let them speak, people were saying. So they shut down, and he got some points out. I don't know if he turned them around, but he attributed the highest motives to the audience. He said, you people would like, your civil folks, you'd like to know I have some information and so on, and I'm willing to give it to you. So, understanding the issues. Let me ask this question here. Is healthcare a human right?
Yeah.
Okay. Can the country afford universal health care?
Yes.
Okay. Is the current system fair and equitable? No. Should Oregonians be able to choose their own physicians?
Yes.
Those are issues. Each one of those is an issue. And I'd like to define an issue for you. An issue is a question, the answer to which makes a difference to your proposition. Does that make sense? If you believe that human care is that is health care a human right, if you say yes, that makes a difference as to whether or not we should go for a single payer system. Every one of the answers of yes or no question to that, when you phrase it as a question, provides support for that. One of the things I really liked this morning about Kevin is that he went through several of those. And incidentally, what was his central idea? If you could reduce it to one thing, what Kevin said today, what would it have been?
People have the power if they exercise it.
What's that?
People have the power if they are willing to.
That's right. How many times did he say that? I wish I had counted. I bet he said it 15 times. Right? And all the other things, you might not remember all that, the fine facts and the data and the research he talked to and so on, but what he did say and what we would remember is the people have the power to do it. Phrasing the issues and knowing what issues you're willing to talk about are key. Whether you're talking to an individual, a friend, or a group, to be able to define what it is you're willing to take responsibility for and how to deal with it. And you can always bring that back to those issues. One of the things I really liked about healthcare as a human right is all of those questions about tax, about cost, about all of that can come back to that issue. So you can turn those hostile questions into support. Am I out of time?
Yeah, pretty close.
Pretty close, all right. Well, let me stop then. I could go into some more about the, I'll leave off the last part then about, maybe I can questions later about the construction of the speech itself. But essentially I'll say this: a central idea, an introduction to motivate the audience and get their attention. A central idea, tell them what you're going to say. That's the central idea. Tell them what you're going to say it, that's the support, and then tell them what you said. Tell them what you're going to say it, and tell them what you said. And with that, it seems to me, if we come together and identify those people, the rest of the people in the community that have those same concerns that we do, and we're willing to talk to them, then we've got a movement going that'll end up with a single-payer system, I think. Thank you.
Yes.